Hello, viewers. Our guest today is Professor Richard Lance. He's an eminent author and academician and also rights activist. Professor Lance, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
First of all, we'd like to ask you that, as we know that there is currently the process of releasing hostages. Hamas is releasing hostages, but at the same time, we know that they're trying to delay the process of releasing hostages, and actually, in our opinion, it's kind of the attempt of buying time. And
yeah, that's for sure. I mean, they're also doing it in the most sadistic fashion they can. But yes, they're buying time.
so when Hamas is releasing the hostages, they're all innocent victims. But at the same time, Israel is also releasing Palestinians, and most of them, not all of them, are either terrorists or they have the record of participating in some sort of terrorist activity.
Convicted criminals.
Yes, sir, convicted criminals. So,
yes.
Don't you think that by releasing such criminals, convicted criminals and terrorists, Israel is actually creating an atmosphere that in the future, these released convicted criminals can cause similar harm to Israel as it has happened on the October 7th?
Yes. No, I mean, the best example of that is that in the previous prisoner exchange, which was one person for 1,000 prisoners.
Yeah, Gilad Shalit.
Gilad Shalit, the guy who masterminded October 7th, was released after having his life saved by Israeli doctors. So yes, I mean, there's a terror, and there are people who are quite critical of this prisoner exchange. Israel is caught between compassion for its people and the necessity of negotiating with this ferocious, it's hard to find adjectives to describe what a terrible group Hamas is, and Israel is forced to deal with them because they have these hostages. Now, there are people who say you can't be compassionate in these situations. That's the principle of you can't negotiate with terrorists, but you can't not. So, yeah, it's terrible. What's really terrible, I mean, in my mind, maybe I'm a little obsessed by the media coverage of this, but, the fact that you've got reporters, there one in particular from Sky News, who said to the Israeli spokesman, well, don't you think it shows that you value Palestinian lives less than you do Israelis because you're releasing 300 people to get 100 back or 50 back? So that kind of equivalence in which, you present women and children on both sides. The women and the children on the Israeli side have been ripped from their homes, and the kids are 5 years old and less. And the women and children on the other side have been literally arrested and sometimes saved by Israeli medical teams for trying to blow themselves up amongst Israelis. It's just staggering, the inability of people to see beyond this sort of false equivalence.
Professor Richard, we know that Israeli women and children and even infants, they fell victim of sexual violence committed by Hamas terrorists and other terrorists in Gaza, Palestinian terrorists. Unfortunately, United Nations is completely silent on this cruelty, and to our utter dismay, when we see that Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar, they are openly, publicly speaking in favor of the Palestinian terrorists.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the American First Lady Jill Biden or Kamala Harris or Nancy Pelosi, they are not saying a word, condemning this act of brutality of Hamas and Palestinian terrorists on Israeli women and children. I mean, what is the reason?
Well, so, you know, we can get into reasons. Let me just make one comment about that. And that is that, you know, the woman who's in charge of, you know, women's issues at the United Nations and has a special mandate to intervene when it's a question of particularly sexual abuse of women is faced with this basically, you know, sort of unprecedented assault on Israeli women. And her response is to say, well, you know, this has to be handled by a different office. We can't do anything. And she says it with a straight face, you know. So, okay, so then how do you understand this? Well, on one level, I think you understand it as the victory of this sort of post-colonial paradigm in which the Israelis represent white supremacists and are trying to enslave the world, which is the protocols of the elders of Zion, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Palestinians are innocent victims who, if only Israel would let them fulfill their desires, which is unfortunately the extermination of Israel, if only Israel would let them have their way, then there'd be peace. So it's a kind of insane, morally and empirically, utterly disoriented situation in which people literally, the media in the West, I've been writing about this, the media in the West is literally a carrier of Hamas propaganda, which they present to the West as news. So in that kind of a situation, I mean, it's understandable. It's not understandable that the media could have fallen so low as to, for example, completely get duped by Hamas about the blast at the Al Ahli hospital, which supposedly killed 500 people and flattened the building. And it was a small crater in a parking lot that maybe killed a couple of dozen of people. They were completely caught. You know, they got it completely wrong for hours and hours and hours. And then when it turned out that they were completely wrong, their reaction was, yeah, no, we shouldn't have done that, but so what? So, you know, we're in tough shape. We're it's very hard to get reliable information. And you may be one of the few beacons in the Muslim world that makes that information possible to get through.
I'd like to also remind you that when Hamas was approaching Israel on the October 7th, they were
Right.
they were accompanied by reporters
Yeah.
from the New York Times, these few other Associated Press, and few other Western
Right. Reuters.
media outlets. Now, if I can term, and I will definitely term Hamas as a mega terrorist organization.
Yes. Yes. On the scale of terrorist organizations, it's all the way to the right.
Yes. Now, why can't we also term New York Times, Associated Press, and all those media outlets whose representatives?
Right. Right. I think there are two problems here. One is it would be utterly ineffective to do that because people would say, New York Times terrorists, come on, what do you think? Don't be ridiculous. Okay. But the other thing is that, and I think that this may be the case, I'm hoping it's the case. The New York Times isn't doing this on purpose. They don't sit down and say, how can we help the jihadis take over the world? But they're so hooked into a particular narrative in which the Palestinians are the victims and the Israelis are the victimizers, that as soon as they heard the news that the hospital had been hit by an Israeli bomb and killed 500 people, they literally salivated. I mean, they were just so happy to have this, to run with it, and then as much as possible to minimize how wrong they got it. So I'm not sure that the media, you know, in the case that you were specifically citing, in other words, these journalists who went over, first of all, it's not clear, although some of them may, there's no problem that others like them do work specifically for the Times or for AP or for Reuters. A number of them are just freelancers who sell their pictures. And Reuters and Associated Press and the New York Times and the BBC are responsible for picking these pictures up and presenting them as news when in fact some of them are really deceptive shots, like the shots of Al-Ahli Hospital. But they're not necessarily working for the Times. The real problem, it seems to me, is that, and you can appreciate this, what we're dealing with is a whole school of journalists who consider themselves, and there are codes about this. There's an Arab code for journalists, and there's a Muslim code for Muslims, an Islamic code for Muslim media men, for journalists. And basically they're fighting a war. They're not pretending. They're not even pretending to be objective, fair, accurate, whatever. When Al-Ahli Hospital, when the Westerners like Jeremy Bowen at the BBC think that Al-Ahli Hospital has been flattened, they're not about to send out pictures of an intact hospital. So for the longest time, all we got from them were these short scenes of people evacuating one or two dead, and we're supposed to fill in the rest. And the media filled it all in. They were talking about hundreds for hours and hours and hours, even after dawn and pictures of the site finally emerged, showing this small crater in a parking lot and a dozen cars that had been damaged. So, I think that what I'm hoping is that the Western media can pull themselves out of this sort of utterly unprofessional enthusiasm for a narrative which is in fact designed by their enemies to undermine their societies.
Unfortunately, we are witnessing that the Western media, such as BBC, CNN, New York Times, right, and many others, they are somehow playing the role of a propaganda vessel of the terrorists, Hamas and other terrorists.
Say that again? Say that again? They're playing the role of...
They are playing the role of propaganda vessel.
Yes, they're taking propaganda and turning it into news.
Yes, sir. Now, also we know every year the Arab world is using their Zakat fund. It's around $5 billion every year. They're using it for buying the voice of the media, number one. Number two, I am saying this based on evidence. Every year, Qatar is spending $160 million towards American universities and colleges for breeding their students. Yep. They're breeding future diplomats, future journalists, future officials.
They're breeding future jihadis.
Yes, sir, future jihadis. At the same time, Qatar is also spending, in addition to their expenditure in Al Jazeera, they are spending $300 million every year towards Western media. So we know this is not what's happening with the New York Times or BBC or Associated Press. It's not only this kind of the insanity in the name of journalism. It's not only insanity. They are doing this possibly because of the money they are receiving.
Okay, so you raise an interesting point, and I do not in any way question the tremendous impact of Arab and Muslim investment in affecting American and European opinion. So there's no question that plays a role. What fascinates me is that if you talk to somebody from the New York Times, Helene Cooper, for example, or you talk to somebody from the BBC like John Donnison, they will insist, and I think in some cases sincerely, that they're just doing their job. They don't see it. It's not like somebody saying, okay, here's $500,000, go out and slander Israel. What they do is they fund this post-colonial narrative in which Israel is the evil person, which ends up being a kind of Holocaust inversion in which the Jews are the new Nazis and the Palestinians are the new Jews, they're victims. You get you get that into the universities, you get professors expressing it, you get students coming out of their classes expressing it. They go into journalism and they think that they're doing good. They think that they are morally committed human beings who are working to save the poor Palestinians.
I mean, it's very unfortunate. Unfortunate. And Professor, you are a very esteemed personality. So when such cruelty happened on the October 7th in Israel, I am surprised that individuals like Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate, and many other Nobel laureates in the world, and the
Right.
so-called rights activists and human rights groups, etc. I mean, I'm talking about these
Right.
Nobel Peace Prize laureates. They don't say a word against
Yeah.
Hamas. What
Yeah.
stops
Yeah.
them? What stops them from talking against terrorists?
Okay, so right. No, it's a fascinating phenomenon, and it's been in preparation for decades now. Basically, it had already been prepared in sort of academic services. They would come in academic, they would first appear in academic circles, and you get people arguing these positions and so on. But, one of the things that I think is driving it, and I have an article coming out in the Journal of Contemporary Antisemitism any time now, in which I argue that what's going on here is a kind of supersessionism. Now, supersessionism is a belief that characterizes what I call triumphalist religiosity, Christian and Muslim, in which the Christians believe that they have surpassed and erased and replaced the Jewish people, and the Muslims believe that their religion is the true religion, and it has erased and replaced the Christians and the Jews who falsified the documents, whatever. Now, I think that there's a progressive form in which there's just huge resentment at Israel. How dare they declare themselves the chosen people by people who actually think they're the chosen people? And so you get these Nobel Prize winners like Jose Saramago, who after went to visit Arafat and sort of launched into this huge tirade against the Jews who think that they have a right and the Bible allows them to do whatever they want. And it's a good description of the jihadi Muslims, the triumphalists. And yet here he is saying it's the Jews. So, I think we're dealing with a world that has been, for my book argues that the world for the last, since 2020, so 23 years now and counting, has been utterly disoriented, utterly confused, and radically misreading what's going on in the land between the river and the sea.
Following the October 7th Hamas pogrom, we
Right.
are unfortunately, or let's say, with our utter surprise, we are witnessing that the thousands of pro-Hamas mobs are protesting in the Western countries, in London, in Washington, in New York, in Paris, everywhere. Even such mobs are not showing up in the Muslim countries. No. I mean, it was supposed to be Muslim countries. It was supposed to be from the Muslim countries, but it
that's
is
a good
happening.
and pathetic point, right?
So,
right.
I mean, why they are not protesting in the Muslim countries? Because it is Muslim country. Why they are protesting in the Western countries? Because in the name of protesting, they are flexing muscles, and they are giving a signal, and they are giving a signal to the Western societies that, look, we are here and we are on the process of our Islamic conquest. And soon we will turn your countries, UK, United States, France, Germany, everything, to Islamic Republic.
Right.
And this is a very dangerous scenario, Professor.
Right.
But
By the way, I wouldn't use the word republic. Islamic states.
Islamic
They're
State,
not republics.
Islamic State. I'm sorry. Yes, Islamic State
Caliphate.
or Caliphate. Yes. So
Right.
they are on the process of Islamic conquest in your country,
Yes.
in London, for example. I will give you data. According to our information, during the last 10 years, the volume of sale of burqas and hijab has increased by 55 to 60%.
Wow.
Muslim man immigrants, they're attending the Friday prayers,
Yep.
wearing Arab attires. And
Yep.
in the mosque, those imams are openly saying, quote,
Right.
Jews and Christians are your enemies, kill them.
Right. Right.
So
right.
you are hosting hundreds and thousands of immigrants,
Yes.
and they are actually your potential killers.
Yes. Now, first of all, let me clarify. I'm talking to you from Jerusalem. I'm not in London. But I agree with everything that you said about the British, and particularly in London. And I want to point out, and I think you'd have an interesting time interviewing her, a woman named Melanie Phillips, a British journalist who worked for The Guardian until she realized that, she realized the poisonous company she was keeping, wrote a book in 2005 entitled Londonistan,
Yes.
in which she said, watch out, this is what you're doing. And now we see it today. Now, I got to say, I just wrote a book in 2022 about all of this process. And a friend of mine, after October 7th, wrote a review that said the book that saw October 7th coming a mile away, because in fact, I trace out all the issues that led to October 7th. But I got to say, even I was surprised by the excitement that Hamas caused in the rest of the world. I mean, you have a Cornell professor of Black studies, and, he's a member, a spokesman for Black Lives Matter, saying, I was exhilarated by October 7th. That was exciting for me. And so, I think you're right that Muslims, what's interesting, I hadn't thought of it before, and I really don't know the data, so maybe you can correct me, but my impression was that the biggest demonstrations in the Muslim world after October 7th were, in fact, after the news of the Al-Ahli hospital strike. And then you had serious demonstrations in the Muslim world. But you're pointing out to me that, in fact, the demonstrations in the West were even more lively and larger than they were in the Muslim world. And I think you're right that what happened was that, there's been a constant infiltration of Europe by Muslims. I mean, huge, over 1 million in 2015, barely checked at the border. They just flooded in. So there's been this infiltration. There are far more Muslims in Europe and the United States today than there were in 2000. And this was a message to I'm not saying they're all jihadis, but there's certainly plenty who are susceptible to the call. And here you saw the call go out. And here you saw groups like BDS who insist that they're civil society groups, that they're nonviolent, celebrating this and showing exactly how little they meant what they said in their appeal to Westerners. Now, for me, the scariest part was I sort of thought once Westerners who are being appealed to on the basis of compassion, the poor Palestinian people who are appealed to on the basis of, everybody should have dignity and everybody should have human rights, when they saw the true face of those who were appealing to them, they would say, oh, I've made a mistake. And there were some who said that, but there were so many people who consider themselves woke, and woke literally means woke to the suffering of people, who joined in. That was really scary because they're zombies. They're moral zombies.
I'd like to ask two very brief questions. Now it is proved that Qatar is funding Hamas and
Yeah.
Qatar is hosting
Yes.
Hamas kingpins.
Right.
When we have been demanding sanctions on Iran and there are sanctions on Iran,
Right.
can we now legally demand sanctions on Qatar?
Well, look, I think, if the world community were sane, and if they really meant what they said about, human rights and in the Middle East, two democratic states living side by side in peace, if they were really serious about that, they would call on Qatar to release, or not to release, to expel these Hamas leaders in their country, and they would be held accountable before the International Criminal Court. Unfortunately, not only won't Western countries demand that, but the International Criminal Court has itself been infiltrated by the Palestinian grievance narrative, in which, if they're paying attention to any war crimes, it's Israel, it's not Hamas. So we're in bad shape. I mean, the world should be in much better shape than it is, and it's not because of, I would say, a massive failure on the part of, here I blame specifically Western information professionals who should have been sifting out the propaganda and giving us real news, who basically have kept us blind for decades.
Before we conclude, I would like to humbly inform you, Professor Richard Lancet, for more than 2 decades now, we are continuing this newspaper and telling the truth, confronting anti-Semitism, confronting Holocaust denial, and advocating relations between Israel and the Muslim countries. And we are doing this sitting in Bangladesh, the third largest Muslim country in the world with 170 million population. I would like to humbly ask everyone who are listening to this, if we can do this, sitting in Bangladesh, why you cannot do this? Why you cannot tell the truth? What stops you? What stops you from confronting anti-Semitism and religious hatred? We are so much honored, Professor Richard, for giving us your very, very precious time. And also, we would like to humbly appeal or request you that in the very near future, we would like to have you again as our guest to discuss this very important issue.
Well, thank you. I'm very honored, and to have anything to do with so courageous and a Muslim initiative, because one of the things that seems to us on the outside, not inside the Ummah, is that 1.6, 2 billion Muslims in the world. There's so little dissent from some of these, awfully totalitarian discourses. So to have someone like you, your organization, that's a tremendous contribution to sanity.
Since you are in Jerusalem, the blessed land, blessed son, please say prayers on our behalf in the Mount Temple Mount, and through you, we'd like to also express our very best wishes to our friendly people of the state of Israel, and we are all praying for the very quickest release of the hostages from the captivity of Hamas terrorists and Palestinian terrorists.
Thank you very much, and I'll send you an article I wrote about triumphalist religiosity, and maybe we could discuss that at another time, because I'd be interested in your thoughts on the Muslim world.
Please do send. Thank you very, very much, Professor Richard, and shalom.